Salam, peace be upon you. My name is Muhammad Laiq Siddiqui, the father of Holophase. My friend, tonight I weave for you what I consider the heart of Holophase in one dazzling picture. If you see it, like mine, it will take your breath away forever. Let me begin with a single image you can hold in your mind. A plain ring. Not a wheel with teeth, not a machine part, just a clean circle. And on that circle, imagine one tiny mark, so we can point to this place on the ring rather than waving vaguely at the whole circle. Now imagine something audacious. Every event we will ever talk about, every happening, every point of experience, every minimal unit of where a fact could live, gets assigned one position on that ring. Not a position in space, not a moment in time, not a number on a ruler, just a position on a circle. That is the first letter of the holophase language. And the breathtaking part is not that this is complicated. The breathtaking part is that it is severe. It refuses to add anything that we have not earned. It refuses to begin with the familiar furniture of reality: space, time, particles, energy as a substance, laws as commandments. Here, energy, when it later appears, is never a fluid that exists. It is a tally, a report, a bookkeeping quantity derived from structure, never the ontic starting point. And here, in the pure language, we are not doing measurement protocols, uncertainty budgets, instrument models, governance registries, or dynamics. Those belong to later episodes. This is the alphabet and grammar only, the language that prevents cheating. We have already covered the holophase language in depth across episode 6 through episode 11, with fuller discussions of the tree, the firewalls, and the metagrammar. What follows is the definitive, complete, coherent picture, kept focused on the core structure, the phi tree, and the three-dimensional infinite ladder that unfolds from it. The first letter, phi. The first letter is called phi, in clean spoken form. Phi maps x to S1. Let every symbol be translated into ordinary words. X is not space. X is not space-time. X is the minimal support of events, the bare structure needed to talk about neighborhoods, local patches, and overlaps. It is the stage on which public statements can even be localized without assuming what the stage is made of. S1 means the circle, the set of all positions on a ring. Phi maps X to S1 means, for every event in X, phi assigns one circle position, one phase. So phi is a circle-valued field. But in this language, field is not a substance. It is a rule of assignment, a way to label events with a cyclic value. This is why it feels like a single silent note, a placement, a pointing, a minimal mark that can exist without importing any extra structure. The first firewall, no absolute phase. The second step is where the language becomes disciplined. A ring has no sacred zero. If you rotate the ring in your hand, nothing about the ring changes, only your labeling does. So the language installs its first invariance. Phi is equivalent to phi plus c. Spoken plainly, phi and phi plus a constant shift are the same structure. Here c is one constant shift around the circle, one fixed rotation applied everywhere. This is not decoration. This is the first firewall. If a statement depends on the absolute value of phi, it depends on your chosen paint mark on the ring. That is not a public statement. It is private bookkeeping. So the language makes a vow. Absolutes are mute. Differences are where meaning begins. The wrapping problem. Why calculus cannot touch a circle directly. Now we meet a problem so simple that it becomes profound. If phi lives on a circle, how do we speak about smooth change? A circle lies to naive subtraction. A clock face is the everyday example. The time goes from 11:59 to 12:01. The change is 2 minutes. But if you subtract the face numbers without unwrapping, you can get the wrong answer. So the language refuses to pretend. It says, to speak about infinitesimal change of a circle-valued quantity, we must temporarily unwrap. This is not adding physics. It is the only way calculus can even make sense of cyclic data. The lift. Unwrapping the circle to the line, locally. We introduce a new tool word, phi tilde. Phi tilde is a local unwrapping of phi defined only where unwrapping is allowed. Spoken cleanly, phi tilde maps a patch P to R. P is a patch, a local neighborhood inside X. R is the real line, the usual number line. And the relationship between phi tilde and phi is spoken as pi composed with phi tilde equals phi restricted to P. Now translate. Pi here is not the number 3.14. Pi is the wrap map, the function that takes a real number and wraps it around the circle. Composed with means do this, then that. Phi restricted to P means phi, but only on this patch. So the sentence means, on this patch P, phi tilde is an unwrapped version of phi, such that when you wrap phi tilde back onto the circle, you recover phi. And now comes a crucial freedom, spoken in a way that protects the language from confusion. If phi tilde is a valid lift, then phi tilde plus 2 pi times n is also a valid lift. 2 pi is one full turn around the circle. N is any integer, -2, -1, 0, 1, 2, and so on. So adding 2 pi times n means you changed which sheet of the unwrapped staircase you are using, but the wrapped circle value stays the same. This becomes a second invariance rule. Any meaningful statement must remain unchanged if phi tilde is shifted by an integer number of full turns. If a claim changes when you add a full turn to the lift, the claim is about bookkeeping, not structure. When you cannot unwrap globally, branch cuts. Now we meet topology, not as mysticism, not as metaphor, but as honest geometry of wrapping. Sometimes a region contains a hole, or the phase winds around a defect. In such a region, you cannot define one single continuous unwrapping everywhere at once. So the language introduces an explicit bookkeeping declaration, a branch cut. A branch cut is not a physical object. It is a declared cut set, called B, that you remove so the remaining region becomes unwrappable. Spoken. Declare a cut set B. The lift lives on P minus B. P minus B means the patch with the cut removed. The deep rule is then spoken as a law of honesty. Cuts are bookkeeping. Defects are structure. So the language installs cut movability invariance. Any true invariant must remain unchanged when you move the cut B, as long as you do not drag it across a defect. If your result depends on where you drew the cut, you have mistaken your pencil line for the universe. Regularity typing, the rule that prevents hallucination. Now we install the discipline that keeps the entire infinite ladder legal. Before you take derivatives, you must declare how smooth the lift is. This is regularity typing. Spoken. Each patch has a smoothness class, C0, C1, C2, up to Cn. C0 means continuous, no jumps. C1 means the first derivative exists and is continuous. C2 means the second derivative exists and is continuous. And so on. This typing is not optional. It is part of the meaning of any sentence. If you speak an nth derivative, you must be on a domain typed Cn. Otherwise, the sentence is not merely wrong. It is not even a sentence in this language. This is one of the sources of Holophase's power. It cannot generate new physics by differentiating beyond what the domain permits. The first derivative word, A. Only now, after we have earned unwrapping, declared domains, and declared smoothness, do we allow the language to speak its first verb. We define the first derivative word as A equals d phi tilde. Speak it slowly. A equals d phi tilde. What does d phi tilde mean in everyday words? It means the rule that tells you how phi tilde changes when you move a tiny amount in any allowed direction on your patch. It is change as an object, not a story, not an interpretation, a precise local record of variation. And now comes the breathtaking cleanliness. A is publicly meaningful because it automatically forgets the unobservable choices. If you shift the phase everywhere by a constant, phi tilde becomes phi tilde plus c, and the derivative of a constant is 0. So A stays the same. If you change lift sheets by adding 2 pi times n, that is also a constant shift. The derivative vanishes, so A stays the same. So A survives the two major invariances, global phase shift invariance, lift sheet integer invariance. That is why A is the first public object of change. Phi is a letter. A is the first word, the first verb, the first thing that can speak motion without assuming a world container. The triunity, time, space, motion, as three echoes of one derivative. Now comes the crucial insight that gives the language its three-dimensional soul. The triunity is not a claim that time, space, and motion exist as three separate boxes. The triunity is the rule that says, once you have the first derivative word A, it can be read in three inseparable echoes: cadence, texture, and transport, whenever a reading frame becomes licensed. We name these echoes. Omega means temporal cadence. Kappa means spatial texture. Nu means kinematic transport. But we never treat omega, kappa, and nu as independent primitives. They are readouts of the same single object, A. So the triunity law is spoken as one derivative stem, three inseparable shadows. They must recombine. This is what gives listeners a stable visual image. A single trunk splitting into three branches, but always tied to one root. And it repeats at every depth. This is the core of the phi tree. One source, three-dimensional reading, infinite refinement. The phi tree, the infinite ladder that never ends. Now we reveal the breathtaking structure you asked to keep in focus. The phi tree and its three-dimensional infinite ladder. Hold a picture like this. At the base is phi, the silent circle letter. From it, by local lifting, comes the first derivative word A. From A, by further differentiation where permitted, comes the second derivative structure, and so on, without end. This produces an infinite ladder of letters, each one being a deeper question about how the previous layer varies. And at every rung, the triunity echo persists. Every layer can be read in three inseparable ways corresponding to cadence, texture, and transport, because the seed of triunity was already present in the first derivative stem. This is how one letter generates infinite letters in three dimensions simultaneously. But to keep this precise and audio pronounceable, we must be careful with what we say. The language does not claim we literally write d to the 10th phi tilde everywhere as if that is always legal. It says, on a domain typed Cn, we may speak derivatives up to order n. This is why we call it an infinite alphabet with finite access. The alphabet is infinite in principle. The lawful sentence depth is always finite in practice. Climbing the ladder, from phi to the 10th derivative. Now, step by step, climb with me up the ladder. Briefly, cleanly, in a way you can visualize. Level 0. Phi. Phi maps x to S1. Phi is the circle letter, a phase assigned to each event. No absolute phase, only structure under differences. Level 1. The lift and the first derivative word. On a lift valid patch P, we choose phi tilde such that pi composed with phi tilde equals phi restricted to P. Then we define A equals d phi tilde. A is the first change word invariant under shifting phi by a constant, shifting phi tilde by 2 pi times an integer. This is where triunity becomes inevitable. A is one object with 3 inseparable echoes. Level 2. The second derivative. Now we take the derivative of A, where the domain is typed C2. Spoken. The second derivative is d of A. Since A equals d phi tilde, d of A is d of d phi tilde, meaning the second derivative of the lift. In everyday words, not only how phi changes, but how that change itself changes. This is where concepts like curvature and acceleration later become possible, without importing them as primitives. But here we keep it language clean. Level 2 is the change of change letter. Level 3, the third derivative. On a C3 domain, the third derivative is d of A. Or more smoothly for audio, the derivative of the second derivative. This is the letter for how the change of change changes. In everyday life, we have a word for an early rung of this ladder, jerk. But Holophase does not stop at everyday life. It says that rung is real structure. It exists wherever the domain permits it. Level 4, the fourth derivative. On C4 domains, the derivative of the third derivative. The point is not to name it with a flashy word. The point is to see the pattern. Each rung is a new letter that is nothing but a deeper question about variation. Level 5, the fifth derivative. On C5 domains, the derivative of the fourth derivative. And here is where your earlier phrasing becomes useful. If D5 is your shorthand for depth 5 structure, you can think D5 is what you can read when the language permits you to differentiate 5 times. But remember the firewall. D5 is not a new substance. It is a depth permission plus a derivative ladder. Level 6, the sixth derivative. On C6 domains, the derivative of the fifth derivative. Level 7, the seventh derivative. On C7 domains, the derivative of the sixth derivative. Level 8, the eighth derivative. On C8 domains, the derivative of the seventh derivative. Level 9, the ninth derivative. On C9 domains, the derivative of the eighth derivative. Level 10, the 10th derivative. On C10 domains, the derivative of the ninth derivative. Now pause and feel what has happened. We did not add 10 new primitives. We did not invent 10 new substances. We asked the same question repeatedly with increasing refinement. How does this change vary? And how does that variation vary? And how does that variation of variation vary? And every rung is still born from the same seed, phi on a circle. This is why the language feels intelligent. It does not sprawl sideways into a zoo of fundamentals. It goes downward in depth, extracting more and more structure from one root. The second pillar, topology, integers, and defects. The derivative ladder is only half the language. The other half is what happens when the circle refuses to be unwrapped globally, when the world contains holes, windings, and defects. Here the language produces something equally breathtaking. Discrete facts, integers, born from continuous structure. The everyday picture is simple. Walk around the loop in your domain. Return to where you started. Ask, did phi come back to the same circle position, or did it wind around the circle one or more times during your loop? That count, how many full turns occurred, is an integer. That is winding. Holonomy is the same idea, spoken more generally. The net turning accumulated along loops. Defect charges are the stable places where this winding cannot be removed by any smooth redescription. They are knots in the structure. Not particles as primitives, topological facts. The power here is that the language generates both. Continuous local structure, jets and derivatives. Discrete global structure, winding, holonomy, integer charges. From the same beginning. Phi mapping X to the circle. So the holophase language is not choosing between continuity and discreteness. It explains why both exist and why both are unavoidable. Excise domains. Speaking honestly where speech is legal. To speak cleanly, the language often removes points or sets where the structure is not well behaved for the depth we want. This is an excise domain called D. Spoken. We speak on D, meaning we remove the forbidden locus so lift and derivatives are legitimate. This is not denial, it is honesty. It is the grammar of, I will not pretend I can differentiate where the object refuses to be differentiable. The four gates, the built-in anti-cheating engine. To keep the language pure and prevent it from being turned into poetry, it carries four living gates. Not as bureaucracy, these are what keep the structure real. Gate 1. Well-formness. A sentence is valid only if it is depth correct. If you speak the nth derivative, you must. Declare a domain where the lift exists, with cuts if needed. And declare regularity class Cn. If not, the sentence is not false. It is not a sentence. Gate 2. Invariance. Everything you keep must survive the allowed redescriptions. Shifting phi by a constant shift. Shifting phi tilde by full turns. Moving branch cuts without crossing defects. Refining the patch cover without changing structure. If the claim breaks under these, it is coordinate perfume. Gate 3. Domain. Every sentence must declare where it lives, on which patch, with which cut set, with which excisions, with what regularity class, up to what jet depth. In holophase, the domain is part of meaning. Gate 4. Non-encodability challenge. Whenever someone proposes a new primitive, the language demands, show it cannot be rewritten using only the allowed tokens, phi, lifts, a, finite jets, excise domains, and topology. If it can be rewritten, it is not fundamental. It is a derived word. This keeps the language small, sharp, and honest. What sentences look like in this language? A local sentence is a statement built from a finite jet on a declared domain respecting invariance. Spoken in text as f of j n phi equals 0 on D. Translate. J and phi means the n jet of phi, the list of derivatives up to order n taken from the lift, on a domain where that depth is legal. F is a rule that relates those derivatives. Equals 0 means the constraint holds. On D means only on the domain where the sentence is defined. A global sentence is a statement about winding, holonomy, and defect charges. Things stable under continuous deformations of loops that do not cross defects. These two sentence types are the language's two hands: the hand of local calculus, the hand of global topology. Together, they can hold both smoothness and discreteness, without importing either as a primitive substance. The complete picture, sealed. Now, the definitive holophase language can be seen as one coherent machine. We begin with phi mapping x to the circle S1. We refuse absolute phase by declaring phi equivalent to phi plus a constant shift. We unwrap locally by choosing phi tilde on lift valid patches, so that wrapping phi tilde returns phi on that patch. We accept lift sheet ambiguity. Phi tilde plus 2 pi times an integer is the same lift physically. Where global unwrapping fails, we declare branch cuts B and speak on P minus B, enforcing cut movability invariance. We declare regularity typing Cn, so derivatives are spoken only to licensed depth. We define the first derivative word, A equals D phi tilde. We read A with triunity: cadence, texture, transport. Omega, kappa, nu, as inseparable echoes, never independent primitives. We build the infinite ladder by differentiating deeper wherever allowed, producing an infinite alphabet of derivative letters, finite jets, j and phi, as finite slices of that infinite alphabet. We pair the ladder with topology, winding, holonomy, and defect charges, integers that arise from wrapping. We speak on excise domains D, where the depth is legal. And we firewall the entire language with the four gates: well-formedness, invariance, domain, and non-encodability. That is the definitive picture. One ring, one letter, infinite refinement. Three inseparable echoes at every depth. Continuous local structure and discrete global charges, born together from the same beginning. And the listener's visual image is clear: a single phi trunk, a triunity branching at the first derivative, then an infinite ladder rising upward, second, third, fourth, all the way beyond the 10th, each rung a deeper question about variation. And around the whole tree, topology, like knots and windings, producing integers that cannot be smoothed away. This is the breathtaking beauty, not complexity, but inevitability. Austere beginnings, infinite expressiveness, no extra furniture, no cheating. If someone wants deeper detail, the full development and the earlier complete walk through the language and its guardrails remains in episodes 6 through 11. Here, the core has been sealed. The phi tree and its three-dimensional infinite ladder, the complete alphabet of a universe written from one letter. Oh, and for the mathematical formalism of holophase language, go to Zendo and search holophase. Always peace be upon you.